Good evening and welcome to Gibson's Bookstore Remote. I am Elizabeth, the events coordinator for Gibson's Bookstore, and I am joined this evening by Eric Jay Dolin, who is joining us this evening to present a very timely book as a tropical storm rages outside our windows, A Furious Sky, the 500-year history of America's hurricanes. Eric, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tell us a little bit about your book. Tell us about hurricanes.
Okay, before I go into the slideshow, I just want to say it's funny you mentioned that this is a timely book. Today is a very eventful day. It's publication day, August 4th, and a lot of things made it online. New York Times book review came out of the book today, which is quite nice. It's not going to appear in the print edition until August 16th, but the head of the book review section, Pamela Paul, tweeted out just a couple of minutes ago. She said, this must be the most timely publication date for a book this year, with a hurricane coming up the coast. And so it is good. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have a lot more hurricanes, tropical storms this season. It's turning out to be a blockbuster of a hurricane season. And I'll go through, I'm going to share the screen now, give you my slideshow to give you a sense of what's in the book. And if you want to understand what we're facing right now, the book is a good place to start. In writing this book, I came across many fascinating stories, like this one from the Great Hurricane of 1635, which plowed into Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies. On August 14th of that year, the vessel Watch and Wait was departing from Ipswich, Massachusetts, heading to Marblehead, Massachusetts. 23 people were on board, including Anthony Thacker, his wife, and 4 of their children. Late that night, the hurricane drove the Watch and Wait onto the rocks about a mile off of Cape Ann, destroying the ship, throwing everybody into the water. The only people that survived were Anthony Thacker and his wife. They washed up on this uninhabited island. They stayed there for 5 days, surviving on some food that had washed ashore, and they were nearly naked when another vessel came by. They hailed it. They were brought into onto the mainland of Massachusetts and saved. And as compensation for his traumatic loss, losing the bulk of his family, the Massachusetts legislature decided to give Anthony Thacker the rights to the island on which he had foundered. That island is known today, it used to be called Thacker Island. Today it's known as, today it's known as Thacker Island. He called it Thacker's Woe, sorry. Today it's known as Thacker Island. It's right off the coast of Rockport, about a mile off the town of Rockport. Then there's this story from the great Miami hurricane of 1926, which hit on September 18th. A few miles to the north of Miami in Fort Lauderdale, a house crumbled and pinned the husband. There was a husband and wife in the house. The husband got pinned under the rubble, and the water was rising. The wife tried to yank her husband free, but was totally unsuccessful. And as the water was getting higher and higher, he was begging for her to leave and save herself, but she didn't want to leave. But then finally, as the water reached her shoulders, she gave her husband a kiss goodbye and left, and he died. And that is just a heart-wrenching scene. And then there's this story from the Great Hurricane of 1938, which people in New England are fairly familiar with, which hit the tip of Long Island in New England on September 21st. There was a man out at the tip of Long Island who was waiting that day for a fancy barometer to be delivered. The package arrived late that morning, but his delight quickly turned to disgust, because when he opened the package and took out this gleaming barometer, its needle was pointing to a reading so low that it indicated that a storm or hurricane was either already upon him or was approaching fast. He thought it was broken. He wrote a letter to the manufacturer, an angry note to the manufacturer, because at this time outside it was sunny and bright and there was very little wind. He drove into town to mail that letter to the manufacturer, but he shouldn't have been so rash, because by the time that he returned from town, the great hurricane of 1938, had blown both his house and his precious barometer away. A Furious Sky contains many more tragic stories like these, but the book is much more than a litany of death and destruction. It also weaves together a great range of captivating themes. There's the intriguing and at times rather contentious history of meteorology, the influence of hurricanes on the course of empire, the outcomes of war, and the fortunes of individuals adds to the story. Critical innovations in communication, aviation, computer, and satellite technology play an important part, as does the women's movement and its role in the naming of hurricanes. In the end, the history of America's hurricanes forces us to confront the thorny questions of how we can learn to survive and adapt to the continued barrage that is sure to come from the greatest storms on earth. Hurricanes are and have always been an integral, inevitable, and painful part of the American experience. Just as we can count on the sun rising and setting each day, so too can we expect hurricanes to periodically visit our shores. If you're among the tens of millions of people who live on the East Coast, the Gulf Coast, the Caribbean, or Hawaii, hurricanes are looming threats that might invade your life. The hurricane season officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. In an average year, 6 hurricanes dance over the Atlantic, 3 of which are major hurricanes, defined as having sustained winds of at least 111 miles per hour. Fortunately, few of these storms actually make landfall. Typically, 2 hurricanes hit the United States annually, and a major one pummels us once every 2 years. Hurricanes are not equal opportunity offenders. While 21 coastal states have been struck by hurricanes on landfall, certain states are particularly prone to be afflicted by these massive storms. Residents of Florida, Texas, North Carolina, Louisiana, and South Carolina, in that order, take the brunt of the punishment, with Florida alone accounting for roughly 40% of all hurricane strikes. Hurricanes have left an indelible mark on American history. Since 1980, they have accounted for roughly 50% of the cost of all the natural disasters in the United States that have exceeded $1 billion in damage. And going back to the late 1800s, hurricanes have killed nearly 30,000 people. A Furious Sky is the history of the hurricanes that have hit what is today the United States. But before going any further, a key term must be defined. What is a hurricane? Simply put, hurricanes are violent, swirling storms with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. They generally form where the ocean's upper layer, down to about 150 feet, reaches the trigger temperature of at least 80 degrees Fahrenheit, thereby providing the heat energy needed to fuel these storms. 2 other conditions necessary for a hurricane to thrive are low vertical wind shear, which keeps the hurricane from being ripped apart, and an abundance of warm, moist air that evaporates from the ocean surface. When that air rises, it condenses to form rain or snow or ice, and in forming those clouds, it releases heat that powers the storm. Hurricanes can be anywhere from tens of miles in diameter to more than 1,000 and over 50,000 feet high. They rotate in a counterclockwise direction in the northern hemisphere and clockwise in the southern. They are characterized by extremely low pressure and relatively calm center called the eye, with the most ferocious winds occurring in the eye wall. Hurricanes whip up the seas, generate gargantuan waves and mammoth storm surges, and pour down such huge quantities of rain that they seem to presage the end of time. Many people have attempted to describe hurricanes through the centuries. In 1772, a teenage Alexander Hamilton, wrote about a hurricane that barreled into his home island of St. Croix in late August of that year. Good God, what horror and destruction. It seemed as if a total dissolution of nature was taking place. The roaring of the sea and wind, fiery meteors flying about in the air, the prodigious glare of almost perpetual lightning, the crash of the falling houses, and the ear-piercing shrieks of the distressed were sufficient to strike astonishment into the angels. And that letter, by the way, is part of the reason why wealthy people on the island of St. Croix banded together, raised some money to send this precocious and quite intelligent Alexander Hamilton to New York to pursue his studies. The first European to witness the fury of hurricanes was Christopher Columbus, who survived one on his fourth journey to the New World in 1502. Hurricanes had a significant impact on the course of colonial history. For example, a hurricane in 1609 smashed into the relief convoy sailing to the Jamestown colony in Virginia, causing the lead ship, the Sea Venture, to crash off Bermuda. It took a year for the castaways to build two small ships and sail on to Jamestown. This hurricane left its mark on history by depriving the colony of leadership and supplies during its most trying time, and by creating the circumstances that ultimately led to the castaways' arrival nearly a year later, which provided the starving settlers with the lifeline they needed to survive until the next relief convoy arrived. Two hurricanes that swept through the Caribbean in the summer of 1780 destroyed numerous British and French warships, killed tens of thousands of people, and greatly affected the course of the American Revolution. Those hurricanes caused the French fleet to decide that staying in the Caribbean during hurricane season was too dangerous. So when the next hurricane season rolled around in 1781, the French sailed north, both to avoid tangling with any more hurricanes and also to aid their American allies. By following this course of action, the French played a key role in the crucial Battle of the Chesapeake, or Battle of the Capes, and the ultimate American victory over the British in the Battle of Yorktown, which ended when Lord Charles Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington on October 19, 1781, creating a turning point in the American Revolution and hastening the beginning of peace negotiations. Of course, hurricanes didn't cease with the founding of the United States, and many hundreds of them have pummeled America's shores over the past 237 years. These include the Great September Gale of 1815, which was just a hurricane by another name. It zipped over the tip of Long Island and slammed into New England, causing the most damage in Providence, Rhode Island. The hurricane seared itself into the memory of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who was only 7 years old at the time, would become one of America's most celebrated essayists and poets. Holmes's 1836 poem, titled The September Gale, humorously recounted the passing of the hurricane over his Cambridge home. One of the stanzas told of the storm's dramatic effect on his wardrobe. It chanced to be our washing day, and all our things were drying. The storm came roaring through the lines and set them all a-flying. I saw the shirts and petticoats go riding off like witches. Bitterly I wept. I lost my Sunday breeches. The Galveston Hurricane of 1900 leveled the city and killed at least 6,000 people, making it the deadliest natural disaster in American history. There were so many dead that they couldn't be buried, and many of them had to be burned. The Great Miami Hurricane of 1926 killed around 400 people, left 40,000 people homeless, and caused $105 million in damages. The Labor Day Hurricane of 1935 ripped through 3 government work camps located about halfway down the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were building a highway to Key West. It is still the most intense Category 5 hurricane to hit the United States mainland, with maximum sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and gusts as high as 200 miles an hour or more. Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Key West at the time, was one of the first respondents to offer help to the stricken. After seeing the death and destruction on Lower Matecumbe Key, Hemingway wrote, "The brush was all brown, as though autumn had come to these islands where there is no autumn. But that was because the leaves had all been blown away. The biggest bunch of dead were in the tangled, always green but now brown mangroves. You found them everywhere, and in the sun all of them were beginning to be too big for their blue jeans and jackets that they could never fill when they were on the bum and hungry. The Great Hurricane of 1938, which is no doubt familiar to many of you, delivered a body blow to New England, resulting in damages of between $300 and $400 million, killing 680 people and seriously injuring 2,000, making it the most destructive natural disaster ever to strike New England. The actress Katherine Hepburn was at her family's Victorian summer home at the edge of the water in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, when the hurricane struck. She and 5 other people escaped the house as it was being ripped apart and torn from its foundation, and they sought refuge at a nearby inn on higher ground. Looking back, Hepburn would later recall, we saw the house slowly turn around, sail off to the northeast, and start down the brook which fed the swamp lagoon. It just sailed away, easy as pie. Upon reaching the Saybrook telephone company offices, Hepburn finally got through to her father in Hartford. She assured him of the family's safety. And when she told him that the house was gone, he responded, "I suppose you didn't have brains enough to throw in a match before it disappeared. I'm insured for fire." Hurricane Carol, which struck the eastern tip of Long Island and then plowed into New England in late August of 1954, left 60 people dead and caused nearly $500 million in damage. The most iconic casualty of Hurricane Carol was the steeple in the Old North Church in Boston, which tumbled to the ground. It's actually the second time that steeple had tumbled to the ground on account of a massive storm. But for the third steeple, the people of the Old North Church decided to take no chances, and the new steeple has reinforced steel to keep Mother Nature from doing anything to it. Hurricane Camille in August 1969 clobbered coastal Mississippi. Of the many people who suffered during Camille, none had a greater burden to bear than 49-year-old Paul Williams Sr., the longtime caretaker at the Trinity Episcopal Church in Pass Christian. The night that Camille came ashore, Paul and his wife Myrtle and most of their children chose not to evacuate, but rather stay in the auditorium attached to the church. The hurricane demolished the auditorium. In the end, 11 of Paul's children perished, along with one grandchild and his beloved wife, Myrtle. Hurricane Andrew struck Miami on August 24th, 1992. It tore a 30-mile swath of misery through Miami-Dade County. A staggering 126,000 homes were damaged or destroyed, while another 9,000 mobile homes were shredded beyond recognition. More than 160,000 people were made homeless overnight. Total damage, $27 billion. Zoo Miami was especially hard hit. About 300 rare birds were lost when the zoo's aviary was smashed, and scores of monkeys and baboons escaped from research and breeding facilities. To shelter Caribbean flamingos from the hurricane, the staff at the zoo herded them into the men's bathrooms, and that picture is shown here. Hurricanes rarely strike Hawaii, but there have been a few of note, the most memorable being Hurricane Iniki, which made landfall on the Hawaiian island of Kauai on September 11, 1992. Killed 6 people, cost $3.1 billion, and crippled Kauai's economy. It also forced director Steven Spielberg to cancel the final day of shooting for the film Jurassic Park. Everyone associated with the movie, crammed into the ballroom at the Westin Kauai Hotel to take shelter from the storm. The crew survived, and a few weeks later, Spielberg, a cameraman, and a few of the actors filmed one last scene on Oahu, since the film sets on Kauai had been trashed. At the end of August 2005, Hurricane Katrina ravaged parts of Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, costing $125 billion, making it the most expensive hurricane ever to strike the United States. It left about 1,800 dead in Mississippi and Louisiana, with Louisiana claiming the lion's share. Ground zero for Katrina, however, was the city of New Orleans, which suffered the most devastating blow. Multiple levee failures around New Orleans left 80% of the city submerged, with some areas covered to a depth of 10 feet or more. Hundreds of thousands of homes and businesses were inundated. Tens of thousands of people were stranded in their homes, which are filled with or surrounded by a toxic brew that one observer labeled hazmat gumbo, which contained all sorts of chemicals, bacteria, and contaminants. 25,000 people took shelter in the Superdome. With no running water, the bathrooms didn't work, and conditions within the Superdome were horrific. It took the better part of a week for a wide range of organizations and individuals to rescue or respond to the many thousands trapped in homes, hospitals, and businesses. It wasn't until Monday, September 5th, that the Army Corps finally closed all the levee breaches, and by October, the city was finally drained. 7 years after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy struck New Jersey and New York on Monday, October 29, 2012, killing more than 150 people and resulting in $65 billion in damages. Sandy's waves pounded the shore and crashed into one another with such force that their vibrations were picked up by seismographs nearly 2,500 miles away in Seattle. New York was particularly hard hit. Many subway lines and automobile tunnels were flooded. At one point, close to 1 million Con Edison customers in and around the city had lost electricity. And the hits just kept on coming. The 2017 hurricane season turned out to be one for the record books. In the end, there were 10 hurricanes, 6 of which were major. 4 of those hurricanes roared ashore, when typically only 2 make landfall annually in the United States. But what really set 2017 apart and burned it into the nation's collective consciousness was that 3 out of the 4 hurricanes were major ones. Each of 2017's trios were beasts, making landfall a Category 4 intensity, with winds of at least 130 miles per hour. Never before had there been 3 Category 4 hurricanes in a single year. The damage attributed to Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria totaled $265 billion, making 2017 the most expensive hurricane season ever. Hurricane Harvey dumped more than 50 inches of rain in Houston within 48 hours, and it doused Nederland, Texas with a shocking deluge of 60.58 images, the all-time record for a single storm. In the Houston area alone, the weight of the water caused the crust of the earth to sink nearly an inch. Hurricane Irma maintained winds of 185 miles per hour for an astonishing 35 hours over the open Atlantic, setting a world record for sustained wind intensity. Irma's winds decimated Florida's agricultural sector, and more than 50% of the orange crop was lost. Hurricane Maria made landfall in Puerto Rico as a strong Category 4, with winds of 155 miles per hour. It passed diagonally over the island, dumping up to 3 feet of water in some areas. During its 8-hour transit across Puerto Rico, Maria damaged or obliterated virtually every human-made structure outside of the capital of San Juan, many within the city's limits. It leveled 80% of the crops and knocked out power to the entire island, leaving 3.4 million residents in the dark. The death toll for Maria has spawned considerable controversy, with estimates ranging from 1,397 to 4,645. While A Furious Sky details some of the most destructive hurricanes to reach our shores, it also recounts pivotal discoveries over the past 3 centuries in the fields of meteorology, aviation, and communications, which have greatly improved our ability to understand, monitor, and report on hurricanes. For example, after studying a hurricane in 1743 that moved from Philadelphia to Boston, Benjamin Franklin became the first person to realize that hurricanes had forward movement and that a hurricane's winds could blow contrary to the direction in which it was moving. During the Great Storm controversy in the mid-1800s, spirited and often quite contentious arguments between amateur and professional meteorologists alike helped to develop the basic and accepted image of a hurricane as a mass of swirling or spiraling moisture-laden winds, the velocity of which greatly increases as one approaches the central axis of the storm, until one enters the calm, clear, and surprisingly beautiful eye. The advent of the telegraph, then the radio, followed by hurricane hunter planes, and Earth-orbiting satellites all contributed mightily to our ability to track hurricanes from inception to dissolution. Such advances, combined with vast improvements in computer-based weather prediction models and the barrage of weather reporting on television, over the radio, and the internet, means that we are never caught completely off guard and have advance warnings of a hurricane's strength and the timing of its arrival. There have also been dramatic changes in the way that we identify hurricanes. In 1953, the Weather Bureau, the precursor to the National Weather Service, began naming hurricanes after women. This decision angered many who thought it was inappropriate, if not downright insulting, to name hurricanes in this manner, and they asked the Bureau to reconsider. One observer argued that associating women with the tragedy and havoc created by hurricanes is a personification of extremely poor judgment. Another was a little bit less serious, but still not amused, saying she would rather have an unnamed hurricane hit her house than a storm named after one of her husband's old girlfriends. The Bureau, however, would not be swayed. It stuck fast to its naming system, making it permanent in 1956. Protests died down, that is, until Roxy Bolton spoke up. Bolton was a vice president of the National Organization of Women. In 1970, she urged the National Weather Service to stop naming hurricanes after women. She was tired of reading and hearing media accounts in which female-named hurricanes were variously described as witches, capricious, furious, bad girls, unladylike, vicious, and treacherous. She said women are human beings and deeply resent being arbitrarily associated with disaster. Bolton offered some alternatives. Hurricanes could, she said, be named after birds, or perhaps US senators, especially since they delight in having streets, bridges, and buildings named for them. She even recommended that hurricanes be called hurricanes instead. The service refused to budge. Then the US Secretary of Commerce, Dr. Juanita Krebs, took up the cause. A self-described feminist, Krebs heartily supported Bolton's initiative. And in 1979, gender equality won out over tired bureaucracy. From that point forward, Atlantic tropical storms and hurricanes would alternate between male and female names. And you probably know that if we have 21 storms, tropical storms and hurricanes. If we get to number 21, then number 22, we don't have any more male and female names. It goes to the Greek alphabet. And I have a feeling that this summer, we are going to make it to having storms named after the Greek alphabet. Meteorologists have not only been interested in forecasting and naming hurricanes, but for a time at least, they were interested in controlling them. From the late 1940s through the early 1980s, there are various government experiments to study whether the seeding of hurricanes with dry ice or silver iodine could weaken them. None of them succeeded. Since the mid to late 1900s, many other methods besides cloud seeding have been suggested for controlling and even eliminating hurricanes, all of which are creative, if not outlandish, and totally impractical. Some of the most fanciful ideas, including flying an enormous fleet of propeller-driven planes around a hurricane in a clockwise direction to unwind the storm, or towing icebergs from the Arctic down to the tropical regions to cool the ocean and sap hurricanes of their energy. Then there's one of the most popular suggestions of all, nuke them. Just drop a few nuclear bombs into a hurricane and blow it apart. The cycle continues. Every year, a new hurricane season unfolds with the potential to break records, be average, or be relatively quiet. But no matter what an individual hurricane season brings, over time, one thing is certain. The United States will continue to be pummeled by these tremendous storms. And because of global warming, hurricanes of the future will most likely be worse than those of the past. Global warming has already made the impact of hurricanes worse. Because sea level has risen as a result of the thermal expansion of the ocean and the melting of the glaciers, storm surges associated with hurricanes are higher and more destructive. A growing number of studies have found strong evidence linking global warming to increased precipitation during storms and hurricanes. The reason is that warming leads to more evaporation, and warmer air is able to contain higher concentrations of moisture, which can come down as rain. Considerable research also predicts that warmer oceans, which provide more heat energy to the hurricane, will make the winds produced by these storms even more powerful. Thus, under the warmer conditions that predictions say will be the norm towards the end of the century, it is likely that hurricanes will be stronger and wetter. At this moment, nobody can say with absolute certainty exactly how hurricanes will change over time as a result of global warming. Scientists would be the first to admit that there are still many unknowns, as well as limitations on the data and modeling that make it exceedingly difficult to predict the impact of a warmer world on these massive storms. The mounting scientific consensus that an increase in global warming will likely make future hurricanes worse, however, is not encouraging. But even if global warming causes no difference at all in hurricane behavior, society still has to grapple with a hurricane-filled future. And as more and more people move to the coasts, the potential impact of hurricanes will only increase. As this book was heading to the final stage of production, Hurricane Dorian riveted the nation. Beginning in late August 2019, Americans watched the round-the-clock coverage as this rapidly intensifying storm marched across the Atlantic. Each day, reports became more alarming as Dorian not only grew into a monster Category 5 hurricane, but also appeared to be heading directly for the east coast of the United States. But first in line were the Bahamas, parts of which were utterly destroyed by Dorian, which essentially stalled in place for an excruciating 40 hours before moving on as a Category 2 hurricane. Some models said it would still strike the US, prompting mandatory evacuations from Florida to Virginia. Over the next 3 days, Dorian hugged the coastline, briefly regaining Category 3 status as it moved over warmer waters, then dropping to Category 1 just before making its only landfall in the United States at Cape Hatteras. After that, Dorian zoomed off in a northeasterly direction, making landfall for a second time in Nova Scotia, where it knocked out power to roughly 400,000 people. While Dorian's impact on the United States was significant, it was virtually nothing compared with what happened in the Bahamas, and what might have happened had the hurricane plowed head-on into the United States coast instead of skirting the mainland and clipping North Carolina before sailing off into the Atlantic. This time, America was lucky, but if the history of US hurricanes tells us anything, it is that such luck will not last. I just have one more slide. This is a picture of me in 1991 when my hair was brown. And it's during, right in the aftermath of Hurricane Bob, which clobbered Cape Cod. And this is a picture that was taken by my fiance at the time, now my wife. And I'm standing next to a summer cottage in Falmouth, Massachusetts that was destroyed by the hurricane. And I'm sorry to share with you that that Hawaiian shirt, which was one of my favorites at the time, after I got married, my wife demanded that I get rid of it, so I no longer have it. Anyway, that's the end of my talk. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm going to hit stop share. And I wanted to add one thing in a second. Let me just hit stop share so I can get back into, okay. I wanted to add, I'm sorry if I looked a little uncomfortable. It is about 90 degrees in this room right now. I had to turn off my air conditioner, and this is my garage. Well, it's converted. It's now my office. It's extremely well insulated. And it was very hot and humid today, and I'm really sweating. So
it sounds like we could have used that Hawaiian shirt today. So
yeah, absolutely.
So now I will say to our audience that if you have questions that you would like to ask Eric, now is the time to pop them into the chat or raise your hand in the participant bar or use the Q&A function. I do have some questions myself. So you mentioned that climate change will increase hurricane intensity. Is there anything specific about hurricane intensity that is impacted by climate change? Is it the warmth of the water, increasing the force? How does that work?
Yeah, no, well, heat is what drives the power of the hurricane, and the warmer waters. We have record high temperatures in the Atlantic this summer, and that's contributing to the increase in tropical cyclone activity, tropical storms, disturbances, and hurricanes. So as the water gets warmer, there's more potential heat energy that can be transferred into the atmosphere, and that powers the hurricane. So essentially, in a warmer world, you're likely to have more powerful, more intense hurricanes, which means that what used to be a Category 3 hurricane might be a Category 4 hurricane. And some scientists already see a signal in the data that we are experiencing more intense, more major hurricanes than we have experienced in the past. So hold on to your seats.
Gail in our audience asks, lots of experts say we shouldn't continue to rebuild in hurricane-prone areas, but the idea is met with lots of resistance from coastal residents. What are your thoughts?
People love living near the ocean. People have been moving to the coastline since time immemorial. Coastal oceanside real estate is among the most expensive in the nation. I don't think there's anything that's going to stop people from living right on the edge of the water line. The problem is, if you're low down and only a couple of feet above sea level, and you're in an area where hurricanes are likely to occur, or even nor'easters, you could potentially have a lot of problems. One of the inherent problems is that we have national flood insurance, which people can get, and it often helps people rebuild their houses in the very same location that they were formerly swamped. So that's one thing that maybe we could change in the future. But I don't see any way to change human nature. As long as there are plots and houses available overlooking the ocean, people are going to move there. And since it's the most expensive real estate, many of the people that live in those houses are quite wealthy, and they can literally, pun intended, weather the storms. So I wouldn't personally live on the coast, right on the coast, if I was only a couple of feet above sea level, especially in this area. Because when we have a nor'easter in Marblehead, where I live, or in Boston, coastal areas get inundated, and there's a lot of damage. But there are some houses just a quarter mile from my house. A quarter mile in that direction is the ocean. And there are a number of houses in Marblehead that are perched 30, 40 feet up on a rock face, and they will be able to weather hurricanes. Although there is one house that's about 30 feet up. It's on Marblehead Neck, and years ago there was a massive storm, and somehow a boulder, probably about 50 or 60 pounds, was flung out of the ocean essentially and hit this house, went right through a plate glass window into the living room. So that shows you some of the power when these waves crash on the shore.
Bill wants to know, is a nor'easter a type of cyclone?
Yeah, it is in effect a type of cyclone, but it's not a hurricane, because hurricanes are warm core. Nor'easters tend to be cold core. And but it is a cyclone in the sense that it's got that circular motion. Cyclone is a very fungible term. We call hurricanes in the Atlantic hurricanes. In the Indian Ocean, they call them cyclones. In the Pacific, the North Pacific and the Western Pacific, they call them typhoons. In the Eastern Pacific, where Hawaii is roughly, they call them hurricanes. And then down in Florida, they call what we call hurricanes, they sometimes call willy willies. So there are different names in different parts of the world. But nor'easters can be just as powerful as a hurricane. You remember The Perfect Storm, which was written about, and there was a movie about that. That was a pretty massive nor'easter that caused a lot of damage, even though it didn't hit land directly.
You know, I do like to say to my friends who live in southern climates, we may not get hurricanes, but we do get nor'easters. The benefit of a nor'easter is we can shovel our floods.
That's true. Well, this area gets about 5 to 10 hurricanes a century. And we haven't been hit, meaning New England has not been hit by a direct landfall in many years, going back to the 1990s. And I think we're due. It's going to happen in my lifetime, that's for sure.
I think Irene hit us, but she was much reduced.
Oh yeah, okay, maybe you're right.
Much reduced. I mean, she definitely
Yeah.
tore up roads, but not
Yeah.
anywhere
I mean,
near.
Sandy hit us, but it wasn't a direct hit, and we were just in the outskirts of Sandy.
Janine says, "Shh, don't jinx us." Um, so I do actually have a question about the difference between typhoons and hurricanes. Do they really spin in opposite directions?
No, no, typhoons and hurricanes that are in the northern hemisphere spin in the same direction, counterclockwise. Where the spinning shifts is in the southern hemisphere. There are hurricanes in the southern hemisphere. Because of the impact of the Coriolis effect in the southern hemisphere, these cyclones or hurricanes or uh, typhoons, depending on what part of the world you're in, they spin in a clockwise direction. So if we were living down below the equator, hurricanes would look a little different from a satellite.
Janine wants to know, does the terrain of Africa play any part in the creation of tropical storms or hurricanes?
Yes, it's very important. Basically, what happens, about 60 to 70% of our hurricanes are called Cape Verde hurricanes, but they start off over the Sahara Desert where hot air rises. It meets with moist air coming off the Indian Ocean and moist air coming from the south, the Guinea coast. An area of instability is formed. There are massive thunderstorms. They sweep across the African continent. They're called African easterly waves. They leave the continent and they float over the Cape Verde Islands. Most of them just fizzle out and don't turn into much of anything. But every fourth or fifth wave turns into a tropical disturbance that may get a little stronger and organized, become a tropical storm. And then if it really gets organized as it's wafting its way across the Atlantic, encountering warm water, it can actually evolve into an hurricane with 74-mile-per-hour winds. So Africa is very important for the genesis or the birthplace of many hurricanes. Not all of them. A number of hurricanes originate in the Caribbean or in the middle of the Atlantic. So only about 65 to 70% of the hurricanes find their origins on the African continent.
I did not know that. So what impact can we see in the next decades to the eastern shorelines changing from hurricane damage?
Oh, if a hurricane hits, I mean, there's massive repositioning of the hurricane. In fact, think about it. Cape Cod, Nantucket, and Martha's Vineyard are basically just big sand berms, and they're losing, sand to the ocean every year, even without hurricanes. Just minor storms, just the lapping of the waves. If a major hurricane were to strike Cape Cod, you would have massive erosion. A number of houses, I guarantee, that are near the edge of the coast would fall into the ocean. And like in Chatham, the bars of Chatham, every time there's a major storm, it rearranges the bars of Chatham, and there are different inlets that are cut out, and the whole harbor and bay and port look very different. So if you took a snapshot of the New England coast before and after Category 3 or Category 4 hurricanes swung by, you would notice a lot of minor and some significant differences in the contours of the coastline, as well as the trees. The hurricane of 1938 that hit New England downed billions of trees. I mean, billions. There was one good side effect, though. A lot of the forests in New England, including New Hampshire and Vermont, were made of eastern pine, were eastern pine forests. The hurricane of 1938 leveled huge stands of eastern pine. What that did is it opened up the canopy and it allowed all these deciduous trees like oaks and maples to grow up in the aftermath of the hurricane. And that's part of the reason why we have such beautiful fall, autumn displays and leaf peeping. We have to thank the hurricane of 1938 for supporting much of the tourist industry in New Hampshire, at least during the fall.
So Bill has a comment that barrier islands are supposed to migrate through after every storm, just not when there are valuable buildings.
Yes, absolutely. Migration of barrier islands and the movement of the coastline and longshore drift are totally natural processes, and storms are valuable. They're a part of the natural ecosystem. You know, I'm not sure we want to get rid of them, even if we could, because who knows what would come after that. But you're right. His comment is right on, because we're human beings. We care most about what happens to us and what we own. So if a barrier beach that nobody lives on migrates a bit, unless it affects people's navigation in and out of a port, nobody's too concerned. But if you have multi-million-dollar homes on that barrier beach and they topple over, then everybody gets concerned, or at least those people get concerned.
So hurricanes seem to show similar damage and leveling of buildings similar to tornadoes. Can you compare the damages? And then Bill also wants to know, how do hurricanes spawn tornadoes? Just wind and water and etc.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on tornadoes, but tornado damage and hurricane damage is very similar, but on different scales. Tornadoes may go through an area and cause devastation that is 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet wide, zigzagging over the landscape. A hurricane's devastation zone are tens, hundreds, maybe even 1,000 miles wide. So hurricanes are clearly the greatest storms on Earth. But they have different dynamics, and I can't tell you the exact details because I didn't spend a lot of time reading about tornadoes, but tornadic activity within hurricanes is quite common, as we saw with this hurricane Isaias, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, and now is a tropical storm. There were a number of hurricanes farther south. So the circulation of the air and the winds in a hurricane interact with the topography and can spin up localized tornadoes. But don't ask me to explain exactly how that evolution takes place. Maybe I'll have to write a book on tornadoes.
Jason says, my interest in weather came out of fear and anxiety of impending thunderstorms, hurricanes, and tornadoes, which I realize are rare in New Hampshire. This piqued my interest in weather and subsequently led to my intense fascination with weather and wanting to study it in college. I am curious, what was the catalyst for you, Eric, wanting to write this book?
Good question. I've written 14 books. Every single topic has been, except for one, has been on subjects that I knew very little about before I started in the book. And that was the case with hurricanes. I had been thinking about writing a book on a single hurricane, but the two hurricanes that intrigued me the most were the Galveston Hurricane of 1900 and the Hurricane of 1938. Unfortunately, there are quite a few books, entire books, written about both of those hurricanes, and I didn't want to add another one to the mix. So I put the idea of writing a hurricane book aside. But then after 2017, the hurricane season that just wouldn't quit, when we had Harvey, Irma, and Maria, my publisher, W.W. Norton, or Liveright, which is a part of W.W. Norton, they got on the phone, or actually they sent an email to my literary agent, and they said, hey, Eric has a lot of experience, writing books that span centuries. Would he be interested in writing a book on the history of America's hurricanes? So I looked at that email and I said, hey, I think I'm interested. Give me about a month to go do some reading and see if I can configure the book. And luckily, I found a great treasure trove of material. I got fascinated by the topic. And I said, yes, but I was primed to say yes because I had already been thinking about hurricanes. Looking at the whole suite of hurricanes over 500 years gave me an opportunity to add a book that I think is new to the literature and worth writing. So that's how I got into it. I was on a podcast the other night with 6 very well-known meteorologists and weather reporters, people that really know this stuff. And they asked the same question, but these are people that have devoted their entire life to weather and in particular hurricanes. I can't claim that. This is something I was passionate about for 2 years, and now I will remain passionate about it for the rest of my life. But my next book goes in a totally different direction. I'm working on a book right now on privateering in the American Revolution. So it's not about weather.
Now, by privateering, do you mean on a boat, as in a pirate, but with papers? Because you've also written
Yes.
Black Flags, Blue Waters, the epic history
Right.
of America's most notorious pirates.
Yes, this is different from Black Flags. This is not pirates. These are legalized pirates, even though I disagree with that terminology. The more I've been researching this, it's fascinating the role that privateers that had letters of marque, permission from colonial governments and the Continental Congress to attack British merchant ships and warships. It's really amazing the impact that they had in the American Revolution. But even more interesting to me are the amazing individual stories of some of these privateers. So it's going to be a broad-based book on the American Revolution, but using privateering as a backbone to tell that story.
So perhaps as a last question, can you give us some historical context of how much warning an average person might have had before a hurricane struck, before we had the early warning systems that we had now? If someone was on a farm and not within radio, say in the 1920s, how much warning might they have had before a hurricane struck?
Well, in the 1920s, there was just the beginning of radio, and there were still telegraphs. So depending on where the hurricane was coming from, if the hurricane was traveling up the coast, hugging the coast, it's possible that somebody farther north would hear maybe a day or two in advance that there's a hurricane moving in this direction. But if the hurricane came straight off the Atlantic and no ships were there to see it coming and radio something to shore, it could be quite a surprise, and it might be a couple of hours or a day before it hits, before you realize that something's happening in the atmosphere. I mean, there are some signs. You tend to have a brick red sky in the morning very often. There are long, deep swells because as the hurricane's moving across the ocean, it's pushing water in front of it, and it's creating a lot of wind-generated waves that travel quite fast. Also, if you're an expert on clouds, you might be able to look at the clouds. If they're very wispy, cirrus clouds and the barometer is heading down, you know that bad weather is coming in. Whether or not it's a hurricane, in the 1920s, you probably wouldn't have known. Before the 1900s, it would have been a crapshoot whether you knew anything about it before it was upon you. But now we can track hurricanes from their inception to their dissolution, but still hurricanes are somewhat unpredictable, as this recent hurricane has shown. Even though you can see it on a satellite loop, even though you can send hurricane hunter planes out to measure what's going on in that hurricane, even though we have powerful computer models that run tens of millions of equations to try to figure out what the likely future path of that hurricane is going to be, there are still surprises. And until the hurricane actually makes landfall, and even after that, you might be surprised. A meteorologist might be surprised, and the people in the path of a hurricane might be very surprised about where it goes and what damage it causes. So you can't, I mean, they're just the most massive storms on Earth. It's very hard to understand them. They're complex beasts. I just wanted to add one last thing before we zip off. If anybody's interested in reading the introductory chapter to this book, just go to my website, which is www.ericjaydolin.com. It's EricJaydolin.com. And there you can read the introductory chapters to all of my books and also find out about purchasing options, but you should purchase it at Gibson's Bookstore because they have signed copies. I signed 1,000 sheets with my name on it, and those sheets were tipped into 1,000 copies of the hardcover version, and I know Gibson's got some of them. Because it's kind of funny, this book was supposed to come out on June 9th originally. My publisher changed it to August 4th back in March, I think it was, and their rationale was, well, June 9th, we'll still be in the midst of this COVID-19 thing, but by August 4th, we'll probably be beyond it, and we'll be sort of back to normal, and you can go out on your book tour. Well, look where we are now. Almost all my talks are turning virtual. I'm learning how to give these talks, which I have to admit to you, I find very strange. I'm still not comfortable. I much prefer being in front of people in person. And what I'm also discovering, I've probably done about 5 or 6 podcasts in the last 2 days. I'm starting to lose my voice. So that's not a good thing. But anyway, I really appreciate anybody who showed up. I hope you made it through Isaias without too much damage around your house. And if you're interested in hurricanes or you're just interested in American history, please take a look at the book, because all of my books, even though they're on a specific topic, they use that topic as a narrative backbone to tell a larger story about American history. And this is one of my favorite books. At least one of the favorite ones that I've written, and the way that it turned out. It also has a bunch of beautiful pictures. There are 118 images in the book, including a nice 8-page color insert.
So Eric, I need to hop back to what you said about red skies in the morning. Does that mean that the sailor adage of red skies at morning, sailors take warning is true?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of cliches, a lot of old homespun, sayings have an element of truth in them.
That's fascinating. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I remember we had to reschedule your event because we had the same thought that surely by fall we will be back to normal, and here we are. But now we get to record your program and we get to share it with people anyway. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Book is available at Gibson's Bookstore. We do have signed copies of A Furious Sky. We are still shipping books. We are open for browsing and curbside pickup. We also have other copies of Eric's books in the store. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Eric, thank you again. I hope we have you for your next book in store.
Yes.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Thanks.